Today's program about the spike in anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism on campus with Dr. Sharon Nazarian and Sarah Breger was scheduled several months ago, but was recorded last week just as new protests were beginning to take shape at Columbia University. Fast forward 1 week, and we never could have imagined the number of encampments, protests, and arrests taking place on campuses throughout the country. So we decided to bring Dr. Nazarian back to address what's happening these last few days since our initial interview. We've included this additional conversation with Dr. Nazarian and Amy E. Schwartz. Now for today's program. Dr. Sharon S. Nazarian is a board member of the Anti-Defamation League and the ADL's former Senior Vice President of International Affairs, meeting with heads of state, foreign ministers, and leaders of Jewish communities across the globe. She works to fight anti-Semitism and racial hatred globally, including in Europe, Latin America, and the Middle East. Sharon is also an academic and the founder of the Y&S Nazarian Center for Israel Studies at UCLA and is president of the Y&S Nazarian Family Foundation. Joining Dr. Nazarian is Moment editor Sarah Breger, director of Moment's Daniel Pearl Investigative Journalism Initiative, as well as Moment opinion and book editor Amy E. Schwartz, editor of the magazine's popular Ask the Rabbi section. Please welcome Dr. Sharon Nazarian, Sarah Breger, and Amy E. Schwartz.
Sharon, thank you. Thank you so much for joining us. As we were talking just before we went on, I think this Zoominar could really not be timelier. I have my Twitter feed open and watching what's happening at Columbia University right now. So it's definitely very timely.
Thank you for having me, and it's a pleasure to be with you. And yes, things are moving at a very fast pace, and keeping up is almost overwhelming for all of us professionals, and I can imagine for parents and other members of your audience also. It's a lot.
And to turn to campuses, now it seems like, every day there's another article about anti-Semitism on campus. But is this new, or did it exist before October 7th and now we're just paying attention, or did October 7th spark or ignite something on American campuses?
Look, I think, again, based on ADL data and Hillel data and others, we have two ways of measuring this. One is actual incidents. And, when you go from, 87 incidents to 740 from one year to the next on campus, this was ADL reporting. And when you go to Hillel Survey of Jewish Students, where last year or 2 years ago, the sentiment of most Jewish students was they felt safe. And then you go to right after October 7th, and 73% say they feel either unsafe or they're witnessed some sort of an anti-Semitic incident. That's definitely a huge shift. But I would argue that most of what we're seeing had been there. What we hadn't seen is the scale of what we're seeing. That's a really, really big shift. So all the diagnosis that we're making about what's wrong on university campuses, who bears responsibility, who is not doing what they're supposed to be doing, everything from administrators to faculty to Jewish organizations, what they could be doing more, to student clubs, how, like SJP has been around forever. I mean, I remember in my 5 years, this was one of the things that I was really monitoring very closely, where they would have conferences. They came to the UCLA campus. It was a closed conference. They didn't, there was their kind of retreat. They were on our radar. We knew about them. We knew JVP. We knew all these actors have been around. But what we saw after October 7th, in a matter of few days, was this systematic kind of onslaught on campuses that we had never seen before. The kind of demonstrations we saw, the language, the shared language that they had. It really, again, I don't have evidence to show that this has been orchestrated, but it felt orchestrated because there was such cohesion among the language, the way these demonstrations took place with days after October 7th. The assault on the whole narrative of what October 7th meant. On one hand, celebrating, on the other hand, holding vigils for Palestinians who were killed. I mean, it was amazing that the through line was really there nationally, and I would say internationally. So there is a big change. There's no doubt that we're experiencing something unprecedented.
It's funny, in an editorial meeting, I think, like right after October 7th, I remember there was a lot of people were discussing that, wondering is the messaging coming across through like WhatsApp channels or something, because now everything is the same. So it's just funny.
Well, we did find toolkits. I can tell you that SJP had toolkits that were spread around because they're a national student organization, and they did have messaging toolkits. They had all kinds of, tools within that, and it was a branded episode that at least we know SJP had access to. All the chapters did.
So with SJP and JVP, they would push back and say, this isn't anti-Semitic, this is, anti-Israel. Is there a difference, or what are the parameters for that? And kind of doesn't matter in a way.
Well, look, we know when you're attacking a Hillel building or Jewish students going in and out of either a Hillel program or any campus programming and being assaulted the way they were in Berkeley, there's no question about that, right? So this is not about not allowing criticism of Israeli policy or Prime Minister Netanyahu or the way the war is being handled. So what we're witnessing on US campuses today is outright anti-Semitism. There's just no question about it, because Jewish students are being attacked for wearing their Jewish star, for wearing a kippah. So again, I want to be careful that what we're seeing on campuses is not every Jewish student being attacked, not every Jewish student feeling that they cannot wear their identity, but the rise in the number of students who are experiencing that is so high that is just absolutely unprecedented for all of us. And the anti-Zionism, anti-Semitism thing is just become so much easier. I remember having to give whole lectures about when is, anti-Israel criticism or rhetoric stepping over the line into anti-Semitism. I would give a whole hour lectures on that. I don't think we need to do that anymore. It's on full display. And sadly, what the conclusion that, I remember Jonathan Greenblatt giving a whole speech about anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism about 5 years ago, and it was considered controversial. It is no longer controversial. This is not about policy. This is not about political leaders. This is not about what Israel does or does not do. This is about an assault on the Jewish community, on Jewish citizens, on Jewish students. And there is no discussion about, how do we feel about Israel? Nobody takes the time to say, where do you stand, on Prime Minister Netanyahu? Or where do you stand on, Israel's policy of attacking, going into Gaza, defending itself, or attacking, or killing, or starving, or any of that? There is no question. There's no time to ask about that. They just do the assault. They just do the targeting. They just do the harassment with no questions asked.
Yeah, we're definitely in a sort of binary thinking kind of world right now.
Absolutely.
You had personal experience with kind of talking about anti-Semitism on campus because you had a class this semester teaching anti-Semitism at UCLA. I'm hoping you could tell me a little bit about that whole experience.
Yeah, stepping away from ADL, I felt that I had so much that I could share in the classroom. I had all these tools, I had all these mechanisms for understanding contemporary modern day anti-Semitism. And so I designed a class based on my experience at ADL. And it was very much a practical class in looking at how anti-Semitism manifests around the globe. The class was offered in global studies. I didn't place it in Jewish studies or Israel studies on purpose. I wanted students who really look at issues through a global lens, whether it's the environment, it's about global health, about so on. And I wanted students who really thought about issues facing our world through that global lens. And the thesis of the class was that really anti-Semitism is a global phenomenon. We need to understand it that way because it knows no borders. And the trends we're seeing are so, consistent across the world. And the first day of the classes was actually last quarter, it was on October 4th. And I told my students that this is really a pilot. This is the first time this kind of content is being brought into a classroom. This was at UCLA. And the first day of class, I asked everyone, it was about 25 students, I said, why did you take this class? The title of the class was looking at global trends in anti-Semitism, was very front and center. And I went around asking each student, and I had some students who were there with intention. I had a student who said he supported SJP, and he said, I'm here because I'm very critical of the state of Israel, but I also want to know, where is that red line? Where does my criticism of Israeli policy step over the line into anti-Semitism? And I said, that's amazing. Welcome. That's exactly the kind of student I want. I had another student from further south, Los Angeles in Orange County, who said, I grew up in a high school where my high school graduating class, half the boys in my class kind of were turned on by QAnon and going down to kind of the alt-right path. And that really freaked me out. And I want to see what that rabbit hole is. I want to understand it better. I'm like, amazing. That's exactly who I want. I had, I would say a quarter Jewish students who had had some background in Middle East studies and classes on Israel-Palestinian conflict. And then I had, I would say a third who were there because they were all, this was a senior seminar. They were seniors, they needed a class to graduate. So I would call them, they're not with intention. They were there, it just happened to fit in their schedule. We all know students have to go through that, and you want to graduate, so you'll take whatever class fits your time. And, by the time, of course, October 7th happened within the first week of, I had my first lecture 4th, 7th was, in the middle of the week, and I came back on the 9th. And by the time Israel went into Gaza, the whole oxygen in the room shifted. And I kept finding the students who were there without intention, demanding from me to talk about how Israel was the aggressor and what crimes it was, perpetrating against Palestinians. And I had to remind my students that this class is not about what happens in the Middle East. It's about what happens to Jewish communities around the world when incidents take place when crises take place in the Middle East. So literally we started in the UK and Europe, and then went around to Latin America, to Africa, a little bit of Asia, and then we came to North America. And they were insistent. And when we talked about, when From the River to the Sea became commonplace on campuses, and I'm teaching the class, and right outside my classroom is the quad, and you have all the protests right there. Would walk through them to get into my class. So all that entered. And when we talked about, settler colonialism, and I talked about anti-Zionism, obviously, as part of the IRA definition, which I introduced to the classroom, they were very, not only reticent to hear my perspective on these issues. There was a lot of dogma. There was a lot of, not just challenging me, but really feeling that because I challenged their worldview, that there was no room for mine, and there was no engagement. It was like shutting me down or shutting themselves down. And there was this feeling like when we talked about settler colonialism, I had all this stuff from TikTok show up in my class. And I'm not on TikTok. I can't download it on my phone, but my daughters who do, I shared with them some of the theories they had about how Canada and US pushed European Jews after World War II to Palestine in order to make sure that the Arabs won't be able to dominate that land. I'm like, I told my daughter, Sarah, I said, Sarah, where is that coming from? She's like, Mom, it's going around TikTok. I've seen it. This is like one of the conspiracy theories. So it's like all coming into my class. And then probably the worst moment of the class for me was the next to last lecture, which was on online hate. I did a whole lecture, and that was the week, Sarah, I don't know if you remember, when the Osama bin Laden manifesto went viral on TikTok. And it made it to the cover of the Washington Post. I mean, you didn't have to go online to even see it. It was right there. And after I finished my lecture, I brought it up. I said, kind of in this tone of like, can you believe it? This thing went viral, and all these young people are saying we understand it better now. And I had a student put up her hand and she said, actually, I read it and it gave me context and I understood it better. And I understood that he didn't, Osama bin Laden just didn't wake up one morning that he's thinking he's going to go put two planes through the Twin Towers. And that his grievances were about our government upholding all these colonialist regimes and all these authoritarian regimes. And I said, let's acknowledge that no matter what your grievances are, targeting of innocent civilians under no international law, under no moral law, is just not justified. And then another student put up her hand and she said, well, freedom movements over time and in history have had to resort to any means necessary because they have no choice, because governments and armies have a monopoly of force. And so you've seen that freedom movements have had to do that. And this was another example of that. And again, I said, do you understand that if Osama bin Laden had targeted a military installation or even an embassy or even a government building, that would be one thing. But targeting of completely innocent civilian buildings is unjustified under any law. And I said to them, this might be a generational divide. I don't know if it's that. I think there's something way deeper than the generational divide. But I said, for us, Osama bin Laden embodies evil. And so any attempt to try to justify or understand or explain away is like trying to explain Hitler or trying to explain Stalin or Mao Zedong. I said, so for all of you, what embodies evil? Who embodies evil for all of you? And one student said, Trump. And I said, okay, who else? And the second one just I almost fell off my chair. He said, Reagan. And I said, do you all realize that as much as you might disagree with the policies of these presidents, they were not responsible for the murder of thousands, if not millions, of their own citizens? And so the lack of knowledge, lack of historical understanding, the lack of willingness to come out of their binary mindset, oppressor, oppressed mindset, all of that, it just all showed up in my class, mostly by these students who had come without intention, who I think were not actually interested in understanding anti-Semitism, who brought with them all the disinformation, misinformation that's out there, purveyed by China and Russia and Iran in order to cause chaos in our societies and break down the trust that we have in our institutions. It's all showed up in my class. And I remember walking back from my class that day and I said, this is not a Jewish issue and it's not an anti-Semitism issue for the Jewish community to solve. This is a way, way bigger problem we have on our hand. And it's really a threat to our the very fabric of our society. This is a democracy issue. This is, our liberal values. And we're under assault. And I don't think we have our eyes open enough yet. I think we're getting there. I think there's real acknowledgement. I was on a call yesterday with the Brookings Institute, this revered think tank, and they were talking about Israel and the Middle East and Iran. And I said, for all of us and our policymakers, are we aware that there are now protests with protesters holding a picture of Khamenei and doing a Hitler salute and wearing Hezbollah headbands in our cities, in Brooklyn, in New York? Do our policymakers understand what does that mean about the threat to our societies and what this represents? And it was amazing. There were 7 of them on the call and all said, we are just stumped by this. We cannot believe that this is happening. And we haven't heard anything by our lawmakers or policymakers about what is the plan? What are we going to do about this? So the class experience for me was eye-opening, heartbreaking at the same time, and very disheartening.
What about the students in the class who were there intentionally? Was there, kind of tensions between those two groups?
Well, first of all, those 2 students that I pointed to at the beginning about the SGP, they were amazing. They were really there to learn. They really were interested. They asked questions. They pushed back. And they said, well, they brought what they had learned in other classes, which was really wonderful. And I think we should build on our own knowledge. So those were really, really probably what brought me to the class every Wednesday with joy. what was also an indicator of what was to come were my Jewish students who would come talk to me after class, but during class were very quiet. And of course, I did not put that onus on them. It's not their job to be, presenting any side, or that's not their position. I don't really believe. I think if students feel themselves empowered or want to, present whatever view they have, they're welcome to. I just don't want any Jewish students to feel it's their job to be defending the Jewish people or Israel if they don't feel comfortable. I don't think it's fair. But I saw the intimidation, and I saw what we're calling now the social cost. There's a real social cost for Jewish students to be openly defending Israel, to be openly talking about anti-Semitism. And so the same way there's a cost for non-Jewish students not to be pro-Palestinian, not to be anti-Israel. So this whole calibration has really shifted now, where the cost of being anti-Israel is zero. The cost of being anti-Semitic is near zero. The benefit and the positive social cost of being pro-Palestinian is through the roof. And in fact, if you're not, there's a social cost to you. If you're not out there, and again, I don't want to use a very broad brushstroke, but I do feel that there are pressures on non-Jewish students on campuses to at least either have a benefit by being pro-Palestinian, anti-Israeli, or maybe even pressured, even if they don't want to feel like they need to be. So I think some of those social dynamics are really, really something we've never seen before.
Does some of your information come from talking to students or from surveys?
It's all of it. So both in my classroom, as I said, my students would come talk to me afterwards. But there's been, Tufts University had a very good survey. ADL's done surveys where we find that Jewish students are reporting that the reprisal against them, if they're openly, pro-Israel, that's a very high social cost, not only losing friends, but being alienated completely, being asked to leave different groups. So there's a huge social cost. And if you're a Jewish student and you're out there talking about anti-Semitism as a real problem on your campus, that also has a social cost, and students are reporting that. And these are probably more activist students who are willing to, bear the brunt of that cost. But many students who are not leaders on campuses or activist Jewish students are choosing to opt out, and both in terms of their identity, but also in terms of what they share openly in the classroom environment or other outside the classroom. They're just not willing. And there is definitely that tendency of kind of self-excluding, self-isolating. I was doing an interview when I was in Australia. I talked about, code switching in some ways. The Jewish students are now resorting to code switching depending on, if they're with their Jewish student friends or mixed friends, non-Jewish friends. It's a reality that we're seeing a lot of reporting on that.
I understand, because sometimes you just want to go to class and not have to talk about,
Absolutely.
Israel. You just want to grab breakfast or something with some friends.
Absolutely. And Sarah, I tell you, I think there are many, many US campuses where Jewish students are just doing that, and they're fine. What I saw in Australia, I was just there and I spoke with a lot of the Union of Jewish Students and with university administrators and the Jewish community, is really the visual assault on campuses. So the fact that every single day as you go to class, you're not doing anything, you're just walking in campus and you see all the Palestinian flags, all the signs, all the slogans, all the loudspeakers. They reported that feeling like it's a constant assault on us, not physically, but emotionally, visually. And I talked to administrators, presidents of the University of Melbourne and others who said, we have groups outside with the bullhorn all day long to disrupt our work. You have that outside, Holocaust museums. You have it outside Jewish communities. I mean, so it's not that we're getting physically beat up across the board, but and I think for young people especially, it's an constant emotional assault. Even the visual, even just the visual. It's like it's overwhelming, I think. And you just constantly in that state of lack of safety, and you're kind of on edge. And so what we saw, Sarah, just the last point about Australia, Jewish students are not going to campus. They're not going to class. Some are not finishing their degree this year. I mean, it's a real issue in Sydney and Melbourne where Jewish students are saying we don't want to go to campus, and they don't have an online option always. And so they're not able to finish their courses. It's a real challenge there.
What's your response to, people would say this is free speech? We're just putting up Palestinian flags. We're just holding a demonstration. We're not getting into any physical altercations with anyone. Why would you prevent us from doing that?
Well, I think the Columbia University experience, it was a perfect example of that, because it's not just that. And I think we do have to find ways. And I think those who really want to advocate for Palestinian rights should have ways to advocate for their political beliefs. And I believe in that. But that advocacy should not involve the intimidation of other students. And that's where the code of conduct comes in. That's where all these tools that universities have and now are getting, under the spotlight. And so there is a way to do that. I don't believe that pro-Palestinian advocacy should be shut down, just like pro-Israel advocacy should not be shut down. But when that advocacy involves the intimidation of Jewish students going into a program that happens to be pro-Israel, or an Israeli professor or an Israeli artist is there, that is crossing the line. And that is not just advocacy of your political views. And that's not just free speech. That's infringing on somebody else's First Amendment, somebody else's ability to share their perspective, their views, and offering what universities are supposed to be about, a free exchange of diverse set of views. It was interesting on the Columbia University testimony yesterday that the dean of the law school, said, I'm one of the only conservatives that was left on campus. I'd love to see more of. I mean, talk about really a very basic diagnosis of what goes on. We do not have a diversity of viewpoints on campuses today. And it's gotten, and I'm using a broad brush stroke. There's, I'm sure, plenty of non-Ivy League or non-campuses who've not been on the spotlight, but we know that's an issue. And we know that even in, high school level, private high schools and others where their progressive agenda by definition precludes conservative voices.
Do you see Jews maybe choosing not to go to colleges? We had asked a question, Moment had asked a question on Reddit about if everything going on campus is making you either change your mind or change your kid's mind about where they want to go. And I was really surprised that a lot of people said yes. And, Jews not going to elite institutions, doesn't seem like the solution, or it feels like it shouldn't be the solution. But I don't know if you have any thoughts about that.
I agree with you, Sarah. I think, first of all, as a parent, I understand. I do think we want to protect our children every way. And we don't want that kind of assault on our children, emotional or physical, of course. But look, ADL came out last week with this campus report card on, many, many, many universities. And I think that is supposed to be a tool that puts administrators and universities and lawmakers, everybody, gives us a very tangible tool to say, okay, there's something wrong here. Some universities are doing a better job and some are really not. These are tools they all have available to them, right? And the criteria they used was very, very kind of rational. The answer, though, again, and my kids, I have still I have 3 children. My youngest is a junior now. And while I know that protective sense comes out, I do think it's important for our students to develop the resilience and develop the skills, emotional, physical skills, to be in uncomfortable positions, uncomfortable situations, and try to grapple with them. Because whether we like it or not, again, as an immigrant, I have those muscles. They were kind of lax for a few decades, after we immigrated to America, but I see them there. I see them getting, flexed again. And I think protecting our students and the message we give them is not the right message. I think we need to go to the best universities that are the right match for our children. We need to give them the confidence and the support and security that they can take care of themselves. And if a difficult situation comes up, they'll know what to do. And yet, I understand the emotional strain that takes on them, but to strengthen them, to give them that resilience that you can make it through this. And they talk about this, fragile generation. I don't think they're fragile. I think they didn't need to have the kind of resilience that maybe going forward, our society will need to be armed with, unfortunately. So I'm in the camp that says we should be there, we should be on campuses, you shouldn't be fighting every battle, you shouldn't be out there if you don't want to be, but you shouldn't step away from any of these campuses, and you should advocate for yourself.
From a different lens, donors have become, I think, very powerful advocates recently. We saw that at Harvard, we saw that at Penn. I'm curious what you think about that. Is it a good thing or a bad thing? I'm asking because I'm conflicted about it too. How much power should donors have in making university decisions?
Look, as I told you, our foundation, we named and endowed a Center for Israel Studies at UCLA over 20 years ago. I built it from scratch with my partners at UCLA. So I get it. I've been in that place. And, our center has a director that runs everything. I have absolutely no power over what the university does, what the center does. I chair its board. It's a community advisory board. So we are real ambassadors and supporters of the center. And I think as donors and funders, we play a very unique role. I think that role has to be played very carefully. I think when Bill Ackman and others, at that very first few weeks, voiced what we all felt, the shock of what we're seeing on campuses, then we all had this feeling like, yes, this is just, this is fair. And we all got a lot of endorphin rush. We felt good about it because somebody was taking a step that felt like justice for our students, what they were experiencing. Now, if you ask me, I feel that, again, speaking for our family foundation, and I share this with other funders, that the idea of stepping away from these campuses is actually strategically flawed. I really feel that we need to stay at the table. We need to continue to be a voice at these tables. And if need be, we need to repurpose our donor dollars. And we all have now reached a conclusion that campuses are, really lacking very much needed education on anti-Semitism, about the Holocaust, about history. I mean, go back to the fundamentals. We need to put our money where our mouth is and support the kinds of curriculum that becomes part of the solution rather than us leaving these very important centers of learning and, again, self-isolating. So I just feel that having wonderful Jewish universities are lovely and wonderful and enriches our communities. But stepping away from these very important centers of learning is not good for us. And we need to be there. We need to be a voice, and donors can be part of that solution. And we have to work with administrators. We can't, just be bullies. We have to also really be real partners and help them. What I shared in Australia was interesting, and also here in LA and others with the university heads is, we don't want to play gotcha. The Jewish community is not here to play gotcha with all of you. We want you to do well. We want to be a resource to you. And we know you're paralyzed. We know that this is a very important, difficult moment for most university heads because of what we've seen, in the halls of our Congress and other places. And so we as Jewish community have to reach out as donors because we have that relationship with the presidents. We know them personally. We've built relationships over the years to say, use us as a resource. Come to us when you have a problem. And we promise we're not going to go to CNN with it. We want to set you up to do better. We want the university to get an A on the ADL report card. So let's work together towards this. And I think many administrators would be very welcoming of that. Some will not. And you saw, the Columbia University president had come much more prepared than the first set of university heads. She, had the benefit of time and having had a lot more preparation. I don't think she was as forthcoming as we all wanted. I don't think she said everything we wanted, or was she truly truthful about the situation at Columbia University, which is really problematic. But at least she knew that, she owes the parents, the community, and others some answers. And that's not a bad thing, but we don't want every president dragged in front of a congressional committee to testify like that. We don't want that. That's not good for anyone. That's a lose-lose. So the Jewish community can be a part of that solution to tell the presidents, please call out violence of any sort. Please repeatedly say what the norms of our campus are. What are the code of conducts? What do we strive for? And be that bully pulpit of saying, this is what we will make sure our campus remains as a safe place where violence and hate has really no space. So those kind of encouragements and support for a university leadership is much more effective than playing gotcha with them.
You had mentioned earlier bad actors of Iran and China, helping Russia, helping foment anti-Semitism, that came up in your college course. How does that happen?
Well, look, if you really want to zoom out, and I talk about this quite a lot, anti-Semitism is a manifestation of what we are now experiencing after the end of the Cold War, this new global divide between democratic societies and anti-democratic societies, between liberal values and illiberalism, between populism and liberalism. So when you see who benefits most from the chaos, from the division, from the disruptions in our cities, the lack of trust and questioning of our democratic institutions, whether it's our judiciary, whether it's our congressional, whether it's our presidency, whether it's our elections or our Supreme Court, it is those anti-democratic forces. And we know that China, Russia, and the Iranian regime very much are fighting this battle in order to demonstrate to the global south, to other parts of the world, that democracies are not only flawed, they're actually corrupt and they're hollow. And so when we're experiencing what we're seeing, and anti-Semitism being the tip of that spear, the manifestation of it serves that goal beautifully for them. It divides, it causes hate of groups to one from another. It brings conspiracy theories. It normalizes lying and misinformation and disinformation. It is the perfect scapegoat for all that they want to do with a group that has a history of that. And we've been always the first, target of those kind of tactics. So there's no way to discount that Russia, China, and the Iranian regime, and the Iranian regime is its sphere of influence has grown more than any other country in the world. If you look at Iran, and I think you had another wonderful program that really tackled Iran and its assault against Israel. But if you look at Syria, Iraq, Lebanon, Yemen, Gaza, Venezuela, South Africa. I mean, if you look at the octopus-like kind of tentacles of this regime through its social media messaging and news programs in 20 languages, press TVs in English, Hispan TVs in Spanish. They are out there, and they, I would say, is one of the bad actors that actually spread its realm of threatening the liberal societies more than any other bad actor. I mean, China and Russia are two stalwarts of this, but the Iranian regime, in terms of its growth, they are feeling very emboldened right now, not just by October 7th, but everything that happened before it and after it. So our leaders at every level, not just in Congress, not just in the White House, but at the governor level, at this mayoral level, at the university level, we all have to be aware and conscious of that, of how that's showing up in our community, in our spaces, because it's there and we know it. You know, turning your blind eye to it anymore. It's just an assault on all of us.
Sharon, thank you so much for coming back on again. It's nice to see you and for agreeing to talk further. It's been quite a week. Since you and Sarah spoke, seems like only a few days ago, the problem of campus anti-Semitism has exploded, to say the least. Suddenly we have this wave of demonstrations and encampments at campuses across the country, arrests, crackdowns, classes moved online, all kinds of escalation. So just, can we start by talking about what happened? Do you think there was a spark or like one misstep that caused this all to get so much bigger?
Well, we know that kind of Colombia became the epicenter of this test match between the protesters and leadership of Colombia, especially after the president testified before Congress. So everybody was watching this battle of wills between the two groups. Once we saw the president take steps to actually invite police in and to arrest, that took the whole temperature to a new level. And we actually have seen pronouncements by the National Students for Justice Palestine student club that has chapters across many campuses across America, put out a statement that we are going to replicate this encampment model across campuses. So that's why we saw a very quick replication, essentially, of the same movement we saw in Colombia on USC today, University of Texas at Austin, Harvard, we saw Yale. So we've seen kind of a very duplicative model, almost to the T, of what we saw in Colombia now getting replicated across many campuses.
Well, you talked earlier about how Students for Justice in Palestine seemed to have a real blueprint, that they were from the get-go, they had toolkits, and that they were poised to make this happen in as many places as possible.
That's accurate. That's accurate, and we've seen those toolkits. And sadly, that's where the real stress test comes between the real student desire to have free speech, to have political activism, which has been a real rich part of our academic and university history. And we can go back as far as we want, and that's always been a vibrant part of our academic culture. And this movement today, and I'm sure in past moments of campus violence crises, there have been bad actors there as well. But I think at this moment, one thing we can point to is that not only this coordinated effort by a national Students for Justice Palestine organization, but also others who are behind it. Again, we have to really show evidence of it. But for example, today, we saw Ayatollah Khamenei, the leader of the Islamic Republic of Iran, essentially welcoming this. So when you have a leader of a country that is not only oppressive of its own people, not only is it the #1 state sponsor of anti-Semitism that has been directly linked with October 7th attacks, that is the #1 state sponsor of Holocaust denial, anti-Semitism, literally welcome what is happening on US campuses, then that really, you have to scratch your head and say, all right, is this really just an organic, wonderful students who are just, exercising their freedom of speech?
Well,
and it's
very
a mix of both. It's a mix of both. But we have to know that there are bad actors out there.
Yeah. So one thing I was curious about when that move that, as you say, when what raised the temperature when Colombia's president actually did call in the cops to clear the encampment or to clear the initial demonstration. It seemed as if she was doing not only what Congress kind of had been calling on her to do, but also what a lot of people thought was the answer is just get tough, give these people consequences. I mean, did they walk into a trap? Was that a mistake? Because it came roaring back twice as, but it seemed from where I sit as if that sort of was the spark that lit the whole escalation. I mean, were the Students for Justice in Palestine waiting for that?
Well, look, I think what happened after the testimony was this pressure for university leadership to enforce their own code of conduct, right? I think that's what the expectation of hopefully our, nonpartisan political leaders. Sadly, what happens in Congress is also a challenge at times because these issues do get weaponized because they're really put through a partisan lens, and that's really not good for any of this. The weaponization of these issues only puts fuel on the fire and only makes the very complex issue even that much more complex. But I think the pressure really came on leaders, including Colombia president, to enforce their own codes of conduct. So she came back and put very clear guidelines about what kind of behavior would be tolerated and what would not be. And that's where she started enforcing it. And through that enforcement, arrests were made, removals were made, and so on. And we saw that the very next day, the encampments were back, students were back. So it wasn't really like authoritarian throwing the gauntlet down, but an attempt at least to say, we're going to have our own codes of conduct. And you see, even at USC today, USC had been very clear about the kinds of expectation they had from student protesters. You can use megaphones, you can put flags in the trees around the area. So I think presidents are learning from one another. Leaders of universities are watching one another and saying, okay, where is the trap? Which, to your point, I think Colombia might have stepped into a little bit, but still, let's not forget, she was trying very clearly to negotiate. You have this much time to remove the tents. You have this much time to vacate. These are the hours you can have the protest. She was trying to give boundaries to student protesters who are legitimate, students. And so when they crossed those lines, then she stepped in. And I think other campus leaders have learned from it. And we saw some really heavy-handedness at USC today, but it's because really was at the end of a process of giving boundaries, saying these are our rules, and if you break them, then there's going to be consequence. So look, this is tricky. This is very tricky because these presidents are responsible for the safety of all their students. Some of these universities are already under investigation, Title VI investigation for the safety of Jewish students, and they're worried about future legal action as well. So I really feel for these presidents and leadership of universities. Not an easy time to be university executive right now. And I think, you have the multiple strategies. You've seen some who've really been hands-off. And, we saw Cornell at the beginning, right after October 7th, when really horrible things. Remember when Jewish students had to kind of blockade themselves in the cafeteria. We saw some very bad examples then. When leadership were really doing nothing. We're really not taking enough steps. You have the other side where, some campuses have kind of gone a little bit, strong and really, and USC was precipitated by the cancellation of the valedictorian speaker who had posts that were not only pro-Palestinian, but deeply anti-Semitic and anti-Israel. So there's so much going on here.
Talk a little more about that. Talk about what happened. Let's talk about the sequence after that. So she was selected valedictorian. Then these posts came to light. It was taken away. Then what happened?
And then the president said, due to safety reasons, we're gonna stop. Not have any valedictorian speech for safety reasons. And then they took one more step and said, we're also not gonna have any outside speakers at our main commencement speech. So they had all these, amazing speakers who usually come to inspire and, big names and big honorees that were supposed to speak. So they cut everything out. and they got a major backlash. And look, that was a controversial decision by Carol Folt, president of USC. But again, that's kind of the camp of presidents who said, you know what, we need to nip this at the bud. And if we let it go on for too long, we're just going to lose control of our campuses.
Mm-hmm.
Now, remember, we had a third dimension, which happened at Columbia, which was a walkout by the faculty in support of the anti-Israeli, pro-Palestinian protesters. So you have that dimension, which is also complicated. You know, presidents essentially are leaders of the whole campus, and the faculty are very much a very important part and voice on US campuses. So presidents, chancellors cannot lose credibility with their own faculty. And that's a very tricky area for leadership. So look, my heart goes out to these leaders. They're really between a rock and a hard place. I don't think anyone's gotten 100% right. I know that the ADL report card on campuses anti-Semitism came out. That was, I don't know, already feels like a million years ago. It was probably 2 weeks ago, where it kind of rated many universities on specific criteria for what would make Jewish students safe on campus and what would not lead to kind of this lack of safety of Jewish students. And that's a kind of a tangible tool for us to use, and I think we have to improve on it and we can make it better. But parents are very worried. Students are feeling, Jewish students are feeling isolated. They're feeling not only afraid, but really feeling that they have to, hide their Jewish identity in ways that are really heartbreaking. And I think it's a very challenging moment. So we have to find ways to move ahead, and we kind of seem to be stuck a little bit. And even since our first interview, as you've pointed out, things have gotten more complicated and a little bit more difficult.
Well, a lot worse, I think you'd have to say. I have one, just speaking to that question, one of the things you said earlier was that one of the problems, the social exclusion problem, was that there was sort of a social exclusion cost to being pro-Israel, but that the cost of being anti-Semitic on a lot of these campuses is near zero. Do you think these arrests and so forth change that balance at all? I mean, you can't really say that the cost is near zero to do these protests anymore, right?
Right. No, I agree with you. And I think now we're at a whole new level. If you look at the social cost, which, these are young adults, and the social dynamic in some ways influences them much more than maybe even threat of arrest. I don't know where threat of arrest kind of lands in their psyche. That we're talking about very few students who are out there doing that. But more broadly speaking, about scale and about all the hundreds of thousands of students out there in campuses, what we are seeing, and polling is also supporting, is that beyond these specific more activist engagement, the social cost of being anti-Israel is not only zero, there's a social cost of not being anti-Israel. So if you consider yourself,
you and Sarah,
exactly.
talked about that already.
That's the part that I think is really fascinating, and that goes beyond just those activist protesters who are in encampments. This is really much more pervasive. In May 2021, some of this we saw in the humanities, in social sciences. It was really limited to some of those parts of campus. Today, it is across campus, across sciences, schools of medicine at UCLA. I think I mentioned that we have that issue as well. Mm-hmm. So it goes beyond those really ultra activist students who are in the encampments. It really goes pervasive, even students who are not out there yelling and screaming from river to the sea, but they feel like in whatever arena they are in, they have to kind of show their allegiance and show their support for Palestinians.
Right. So I just want to go back to the encampments for 1 second, because that's something that's really new. I mean, relatively recent. One of the useful things you said, I thought, in the early part was you made a very helpful distinction, and I know this is all about inner places. It's very difficult to make these distinctions. In talking about Columbia, where you said, I quote, "I don't believe pro-Palestinian advocacy should be shut down, but that also advocacy should not involve the intimidation of other students." Right. So where do these encampments fall on this spectrum of advocacy versus peaceful protest versus intimidation? versus violence?
Look, we've seen pretty disturbing videos, for example, from those encampments of Jewish students coming in, the pro-Palestinian, anti-Israeli, whatever you want to call them, students in the encampments forming a circle of intimidation, and then push to shove, and actually, physical interaction and altercation, I would say, violence. I mean, I don't think, thankfully, anyone's been severely beaten so far, but I worry that those lines are getting crossed. Look, every minute. This is now a changing story by the minute. We could get off this interview and God forbid some other incident could have happened. So what is very imperative is for leadership of universities to be very clear with their students, because we know those who are inciting the worst are not students. They're coming off campus. So today, USC, just as before I got on, they closed the campus. USC right now is closed campus. It reminds me of the Rodney, after the Rodney Peer trials. I'm really dating myself, but the campus at USC is sitting in downtown Los Angeles. It's a closed campus if they want it to be. They're not allowing non-students on. And that is a reflection of the fact that they recognize that many of the ones inciting are not actual students.
Right.
Public universities, it's much harder to do that because those are open universities, open campuses. UCLA is like that. So we really have a distinction there. So I think, look, that line of what is really allowed protected speech and political activism, and what is it that is not and is harmful and it's harassment, comes down to the very rules of each university. And I know that every single university has looked at their own code of conduct right now. Everyone. They've all gone back to those documents. They've all shared it. I've seen it for multiple campuses. And that's what also ADL looked at. What is your code of conduct? How much are you adhering to it? How much are you just, making sure that whoever crosses those lines, there's actual consequence. When there's no consequence, Amy, that is really when things get out of control and they can slide very quickly into complete, lack of control and violence and mayhem and students getting harassed. So there is the line, and I think, like all, we have to rely on the university's own rules.
So what's a good code of conduct? Like, give us a sample phrasing that would work, no intimidation of other students, or how do they usually put it?
So any behavior that through political activism puts another student, doesn't matter who, in harm's way. By the way, we have to also include emotional conduct. We saw at Harvard, for example, if you remember, Jewish students walking with their kippah and having an Israeli flag around their shoulders, and they were physically accosted. So if, as a Jewish student, you cannot walk on a campus unless you say no flags are allowed. If part of your code of conduct is you cannot have, maybe except the American flag, because we are Americans and that should be allowed, but I don't know, universities can decide no flags of other countries on our campus. Is that against free speech? Maybe. Could be argued. But if it is allowed to have flags, the Jewish students should be able to put a flag on their dorm window, should be able to put a flag on their computer laptop. At this moment, they cannot.
Either flag, right? Either a
Jewish flag,
any flag, Israeli flag,
I think
Palestinian flag.
At this point, the Palestinian flag, I don't think, Amy, I think we'd agree is such a problem. The problem and real challenge right now is the Israeli flag.
Right.
And that right now is not being tolerated. So that's really the double standards. The other thing I would add is what Columbia has done, which is really, I think, difficult right now, is telling Jewish students that they have the option to, go to class only on Zoom, that they don't have to participate physically.
Was that an official thing? I thought that was just that rabbi.
No.
The hybrid announcement was not for all classes. I thought it was for everybody.
Initially, they went, I think, for a very short period, maybe one day, if I'm not mistaken. Don't quote me on that. It was everybody was on Zoom, and then they went to hybrid. When it went to hybrid, they said, you can choose. They didn't say who should be on. They said you have the option. But essentially, in a way, the message is that if you're a Jewish student and you don't feel safe, you can stay in your dorm, meaning we can't keep you safe, essentially. So where is the responsibility lie? Saying, I've seen references to, separate but equal here. Are Jewish students being treated differently, equally, but differently. Now, again, the policy doesn't say Jewish or Palestinian or Buddhist. It just says students. It's a hybrid, offering. But is the effect of it that Jewish students will not come to class and stay on Zoom because they're intimidated and because they're harassed? So it's too soon. We've just seen it. I've seen references of those who criticize this, students who have, like the Colombian students for Jewish students leadership. They've talked about it leading to more isolation of Jewish students. So they're speaking on it. We don't have data. We don't know if Jewish students are not going to class. What I can tell you, I'm just back from Australia, and my lens is a very global lens. Jewish students in Sydney are not going to class.
Right, you mentioned that earlier.
And so we're seeing those trends now in other countries as well. So is the effect of saying, okay, you can do hybrid, and is the effect that only Jewish students are the ones staying, in their dorms or staying at home, not going to class, not participating on campus life? That would be a very bad outcome. That would not be good.
Yeah. Ugh. Wow. So where does this all end? I mean, not in an ultimate way, but what happens? Will this just tail off when the school year ends, or is there any? Do you see any?
School year ending will help, no doubt, because classes end, students go back home, especially in the U.S., where many students are in dormitories, so they go home. For sure, that will temper things down. The encampments will go away. How will it manifest after that? Kind of the anti-Israel, pro-Palestinian vitriol. How will it manifest? We'll see. But definitely, I think campuses, once graduation, and by the way, the next thing is going to be the graduation ceremony, the commencement ceremonies. They're all petrified of those. There's a lot of fear around disruptions, even not only intimidation, but also violence. So there's a lot. We have one more thing before campuses close down for the summer. But once class is done, for sure, we'll have at least till the fall to see what happens in the Middle East, what happens here, and where do we go from here?
And actually, even before that, I think you said before that they've called for a rolling series of further encampments tomorrow the next day, right? Every day.
That's right. No, we'll see. Yeah. I mean, even today, it went from like 1 to 5 campuses, very similar. We'll see what tomorrow brings. Unfortunately, this is something that we're not at the end of yet.
Right. You said earlier that toward the end that you and Sarah were discussing people sort of either fleeing the universities or the schools into all Jewish enclaves, going to day schools because they are experiencing anti-Semitism, or more generally thinking about not attending these universities, both students and, on the other hand, donors. And you said that you don't think that Jews should withdraw from these spaces, that if possible, they should be resilient and stay in and fight. Do you still feel that way a week later?
Look, I think we can minimize the both emotional and physical impact this is having on Jewish students. We're seeing the evidence of it. The students are speaking up. They're telling us how they're feeling. This is taking a real toll. And it's not something you can just, say, buck up and take it. So, and it was interesting today, I noticed that Brandeis University, that kind of got the only one of 2 universities that got an A on ADL's report card. They extended their deadline for transfer students to Brandeis. And that's kind of some similar pattern, saying, come to a Jewish safe university and you don't have to deal with that. I get it, and I understand parents, and I even understand students who would want, and they should have that option and choice. But as a policymaker, as someone who has studied this globally, and as someone who is an immigrant to this country, from a country where the same pattern of university students really revolting against the Shah of Iran and asking for a revolution in Iran. That's why my family left Iran in 1978. That's where it started. It was on university campuses by students some of them were radical, they were socialists, they were Marxists, but essentially they were anti-Shah and wanted democracy in Iran. I have to tell you, being an American today, I don't think we can step away from these very important, not only elite institutions, but any table that is important for our future as a community. By self-isolating, by removing ourselves from these centers of power, by removing ourselves from elite institutions, we're kind of giving in, first of all, to these really negative trends. And secondly, sometimes repeating some of the history of our people when there was no democracy, where there were no institutions that protected our forefathers. So as an Iranian American, I don't want to give up. I really don't want to give up on any of these important stakeholders in our society. And I will, do whatever I can to empower our community to feel strong. That's what I did in Australia. I mean, that community was very integrated and safe. And now the rug has been pulled out from under them. But they have to realize that they have tools. They're a democracy. Their multiculturalism is a very important part of their identity, and that's under attack now. So we as a community have to say we have tools, we have resilience, and we are part of this democratic liberal societies that is supposed to protect us. So we have to hold our government, our lawmakers accountable, and the presidents of our universities accountable. So I don't want to step away. I don't think that's right for us.
I wanted to ask what can we as the American Jewish community do to help Jewish students on college campuses? I think, we all want to help in some way, but we don't really know how.
Sarah, this is an all hands on deck moment. I can't tell you, all of us Jewish professionals, how many emails, calls, texts we get from parents or students asking for help, for us to show up. And believe me, I want to be on every campus. I want to be out there speaking to every president, every administrator, all the faculty, and we can't. There's just too many right now. So as parents, as alumni, as leaders in the community, every one of us that is up for it has to engage with every incident. We cannot let things go by and ignore it and say, it's not for me to write that letter. It's not for me to use my network to get to that president to say what is going on your campus is abhorrent and it's making our Jewish students feel unsafe. And it's your responsibility. We have all these Title VI investigations going on now across so many campuses, which is a lever. It's a lever that we have and our government has. It's the responsibility of our government to keep our students safe. But we as a community also have means, and we have also our own levers. And every parent and every alumni and every donor, we have to use the network, the power, the influence that we have to advocate for our students. And they deserve that protection. They deserve to feel that there's a community behind them. And I think speaking to our students, and look, there are amazing students out there. I mean, you see the ones who've been testifying before Congress. They are amazing. They're breathtaking in terms of their courage, in terms of their confidence. They're all future leaders. That's the silver lining of this. We're going to have such an amazing, whole class of leaders coming into our community and leading our institutions. So that's the silver lining, and I'm so proud of them. By the way, I have to see there's so many of them are Iranian kids. I'm so happy to see, Iranian students, young women, testifying before Congress, and it makes me so proud. So there is that side of it, and parents have to see that. And I know those parents are so proud of their young students who are being such leaders at this moment. So giving our kids that confidence to say, if you want to, we're right there behind you. Use your voice. You have a right to demand from your administration to feel safe on campus, to be your full self, to have your identity not defined by somebody else, but by yourself. Where Israel fits in your identity, how you feel about the state of Israel. It is not up onto somebody else, an SJP or other groups, to define who you are. So there's a lot we can do, actually. And I think all of us, most of the time, what I've been saying to parents recently is, here's a letter you can write. Here's just an inspiration. You can do this, empowering every member of our community to do whatever they can. By the way, same true as in high schools and middle schools and elementary schools. We're talking a lot about university campuses, but ADL also came out with data showing that the problem is really pervasive. It's not just on university level, but really elementary, middle, and high schools are also experiencing similar incidents and real rise in incidents.
Well, thank you very much, Sharon, for taking the time to talk to us.
My
Really
pleasure, Sarah. Thank you for having me, and thank you for this really important conversation. Thank you for all that you're doing at Moments Magazine.
Thank you.